You didn't stumble on this channel by accident. Stay, subscribe, and let's uncover the truth together. Her hands were folded, undisturbed, for 45 centuries. In 2015, archaeologists in Haryana lifted her skeleton, catalog number I6113, out of a burial pit inside the ruins of one of the largest cities on Earth in 2500 BCE, a walled settlement older than the pyramids of Giza. Her genome went to a lab. What came back should have been routine. It wasn't. Her DNA carries zero detectable trace of steppe ancestry. The exact population later generations were taught had swept in and built the civilization she was buried inside. And yet the language spoken across most of northern India today, the religious texts that shaped a subcontinent, the caste hierarchy still governing social life for over 1 billion people, all trace, in part, to a population that arrived only after she was already dead, which means the story got the order backward. The invaders didn't found her civilization. They inherited the wreckage of it. For 150 years, the timeline ran one direction in every textbook printed. Genetics just proved it runs the other way. So if the people who actually built India's first cities carry none of the ancestry credited with civilizing them, whose descendants are we really looking at when we look at India today? The story most of us inherited is simple, almost too simple. In the 1800s, an Oxford philologist named Max Muller noticed something striking. Sanskrit, the sacred language of Vedic India, shared deep structural roots with Latin and Greek. From that single observation, he built an entire migration, a fair-skinned, chariot-driving Aryan people, sweeping down from the north around 1500 BCE, bringing with them a new language, a new religion, and eventually a rigid social hierarchy that would outlast empires. The theory was built on grammar, not bones, not blood, grammar. 20th century archaeology softened the word invasion into the gentler migration, but the skeleton of the idea never changed. Outsiders arrive, outsiders civilize, outsiders reorganize everything beneath them. Under this model, the Indus Valley Civilization, the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with their drainage systems and standardized brick and undeciphered script, was assumed to have collapsed under the weight of this incoming population, sometime around 1900 BCE. The Rig Veda, composed in early Sanskrit and full of horses, chariots, and cattle raids, was treated as the literary fingerprint of the very people who supposedly walked in and took over. And modern genetics did, eventually, confirm a piece of this. There really is a population geneticists call ancestral North Indian, or ANI, and it really does carry steppe-related DNA, showing up more heavily in northern populations and in groups that historically sat higher in the social hierarchy. On the surface, the old story looks vindicated, but the timing doesn't work. Here is where it gets complicated. The Indus Valley didn't collapse because someone rode in from outside and knocked it down. It was already unraveling, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone crossing a border. The decline of the Indus cities is now dated to roughly 1900 BCE, and the cause researchers keep landing on isn't an army. It's rainfall. Paleoclimate data shows a documented weakening of the monsoon and a shifting of the river systems the cities depended on. A slow environmental unraveling, not a sudden military one. That decline was already centuries underway before any significant steppe-related ancestry shows up anywhere in the Indian gene pool. In 2019, a team led by geneticist Vagesh Narasimhan, then at Harvard Medical School and the Broad Institute, working alongside population geneticist David Reich, published a sweeping study in the journal Science called The Formation of Human Populations in South and Central Asia. It sequenced ancient genomes across the region and pinned the actual arrival of steppe ancestry in South Asia to somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BCE, after the cities were already emptying out, not before. Think of ancestry the way you'd think of ingredients folded into a recipe. Once a component is mixed in, it shows up in every dish made afterward. Steppe ancestry simply isn't in the batter yet at the moment the cities start failing. It gets added later. And when it does arrive, the study found it's a specific flavor. Ancestry related to the Sintashta and Andronovo cultures of the Eurasian steppe, genetically distinct from the Iranian farmer-related ancestry that had already folded into the local population 1,000 years earlier, back when the Indus cities were still being built, not abandoned. And this is the detail that recontextualizes everything you just heard about who built those cities in the first place. The people who raised Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were never a single, undiluted, original population waiting to be invaded. They were already a mixture. Roughly Iranian farmer-related ancestry blended with a much older lineage geneticists call AASI, ancient ancestral South Indian, closely related to the Onge people of the Andaman Islands today, descendants of some of the very first modern humans to walk out of Africa into South Asia more than 60,000 years ago. There was no pure, unmixed population standing there waiting to be conquered. There was already a blend. Skeleton I6113 is the proof. Iranian farmer-related ancestry plus AASI, and not one trace of steppe DNA. The population credited with building the civilization the invaders supposedly seized had already done all the mixing that mattered, long before anyone from the steppe showed up. Not by years, by centuries. The gap between the fall of the cities and the arrival of the population blamed for that fall isn't a rounding error in the data. It's a structural hole in the story itself. The anomaly was never that steppe ancestry exists in the Indian gene pool. Of course it does. That part checks out. The anomaly is when it shows up, after the collapse, not as its cause, landing on a population that was already, itself, the product of two much older waves of migration folded together over tens of thousands of years. So if the invaders arrived after the fall, not to cause it, but into whatever was left of it, what were they actually doing once they got there? The explanation researchers reach for first is, on paper, the tidiest one available. The first theory says this: elite dominance. Small, mobile groups of steppe-descended pastoralists, disproportionately male, researchers are careful to note, based on the genetic signature, moved into South Asia sometime between 2000 and 1500 BCE and, rather than conquering by force, integrated into existing communities through marriage and political alliance. Language and religious vocabulary spread downward from a position of social prestige, not upward through violence. The evidence for this is genuinely strong in places. Across nearly 140 present-day Indian populations sampled in the Narasimhan and Reich dataset, steppe ancestry ranges from close to 0 in some southern and tribal groups to over 20 or 30% in some northern, historically higher-ranked groups. A gradient spreading outward from a point of contact, not a uniform wave crashing over the whole subcontinent at once. The Y chromosome data sharpens the picture further. A paternal lineage called R1AGZ93, passed, like a surname, only from father to son, generation after generation, shows up across much of northern and central India today, and it matches steppe pastoralist Y DNA almost exactly. Meanwhile, the maternal DNA in those same populations, passed down the mother's line, stays overwhelmingly local, overwhelmingly South Asian. Elite dominance. That's the pattern the data spells out. Elite dominance. Marriage, not massacre. It's a clean theory. It fits the linguistic evidence Max Muller noticed 2 centuries ago. It fits the archaeological gradient, and researchers are careful to frame it as the best supported explanation currently available, not a settled fact. But it has a limitation, and the limitation is the kind that doesn't resolve quietly. Elite dominance can explain how a small incoming population spread its language and a slice of its ancestry across a much larger existing one. What it cannot explain is why that mixing, after however many centuries of blending happily into local communities, suddenly, and almost completely, stopped. Every population in India today carries the fingerprints of ancient mixture. Almost none of them carry evidence of recent mixture. And that stopping point isn't vague. It's dated with uncomfortable precision. In 2013, geneticist Priya Morjani, then at UC Berkeley and working with David Reich, published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics, tracking exactly when large-scale mixing between the steppe-descended ANI population and the older ASI-descended population came to an end. Her answer, roughly 1,900 years ago. And after that point, across a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people, it essentially never resumed. Elite dominance can explain a migration. It cannot explain why, 1,900 years ago, an entire subcontinent seems to have collectively decided to stop mixing, permanently. That answer requires a second, far more complicated explanation. A subcontinent doesn't stop mixing by accident. Something locked it in place, and researchers think they've identified what. The second theory doesn't look at migration at all. It looks at what happened after the migration was already finished. Priya Morjani's 2013 study didn't just date the end of large-scale mixing to roughly 1,900 years ago. It identified a mechanism. What she found, in population after population, was the genetic signature of strict endogamy. Groups suddenly, sharply confining marriage to within defined social boundaries, and staying confined for the next 19 centuries. The timing lines up with something historians already knew about: the hardening of the jati or caste system in the early centuries CE, a period when social rules about who could marry whom went from custom to something closer to law. Think of it like a river that had been braiding freely across a floodplain for thousands of years suddenly getting channeled into concrete. After that point, the water doesn't mix with the water next to it anymore, no matter how close the two channels run. And the effect wasn't subtle. Many present-day Indian groups are, genetically, almost as distinct from their next-door neighbors as populations separated by entire continents. An extraordinary degree of isolation for people who have lived side by side, sometimes in the same village, for 2,000 years. The 2019 Narasimhan and Reich dataset pushed this further, and this is where the theory gets uncomfortable. Across the roughly 140 groups they sampled, the proportion of Steppe Iranian farmer-related ancestry, the ANI component, tends to track with traditional ritual rank. Groups positioned higher in that centuries-old hierarchy tend to carry more ANI ancestry. Groups historically placed outside or at the bottom of it tend to carry more of the older AASI component instead. Some socially marginalized and tribal populations in the study carry over 60, even 65% AASI-related ancestry, the highest proportion found in any population sampled anywhere on Earth. Some of the highest-ranked groups, meanwhile, carry steppe ancestry proportions closer to what you'd find in parts of Central Asia than to their own geographic neighbors 2 villages away. Researchers are careful to frame this as a real but imperfect correlation, not an iron law. Dozens of sampled groups break the pattern outright, and every study on this stresses that ancestry proportion is not a marker of purity. It's a record of which marriage network a group's ancestors were sealed inside, and nothing more. But sit with what that correlation actually implies, because it runs backward from what the old invasion story would predict. If ritual rank tracks steppe ancestry, then the traditions that spent the longest centuries most fiercely guarding themselves against outside or foreign contamination are, genetically, the ones carrying the largest share of exactly that outside ancestry, not the smallest, the largest. The purity the story was built around turns out to run in the opposite direction from the actual DNA. That inversion alone would be enough to sit with. But there's a third possibility, and it's the one most researchers are far more hesitant to say out loud. The third theory asks a harder question. What if the endogamy wall wasn't a side effect of the migration at all? What if it was the point? A minority of researchers have floated a reading that goes further than Morjani's data alone can prove, that the sharp, almost total end of intermixing 1,900 years ago wasn't the slow drift of a culture settling into habit, but something closer to deliberate design, the institutionalization of birth-based social boundaries, codified in texts like the Manusmriti, compiled in roughly that same window, somewhere between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE. Here is where the science and the speculation have to be pulled apart carefully, because they get blurred easily. Under this reading, the genetic data isn't just recording a social system taking shape, it's recording the exact moment that system became close to inescapable, locking the descendants of one shared ancient mixture event into fixed categories for more than 70 generations, categories many of their descendants are still born into today. But this is where the hedge has to be stated plainly. Population geneticists can date when the mixing stopped with real precision. They cannot tell you why, because intent and ideology and enforcement are questions for historians and textual scholars, not for a genome. No peer-reviewed study has drawn a direct causal line from the Manusmriti's compilation to Morjani's endogamy date. The timing overlaps, and overlap is not proof. That link stays, for now, an interpretation, not a finding. Whatever the true cause, one image captures what that wall actually meant for the people who spent 2,000 years living inside it. Picture the excavation trench at Rakhigarhi, January 2015, 4 meters down. You're crouched in a narrow, mud-brick-lined pit, inside what was once one of the largest cities on Earth in 2500 BCE, larger in footprint than several of its contemporaries in Mesopotamia, and still, to this day, home to a script nobody has ever managed to decipher. Your trowel scrapes against something curved, bone, then a jaw. This is skeleton I6113, lying on her side exactly as she was laid down, undisturbed for 4,500 years, in a cemetery that shows no burn layer, no scattered weapons, none of the violence the old invasion story would require. Around you, the ordinary infrastructure of a civilization that had no known king, no palace, no temple ever identified, drainage channels running beneath the streets, fired bricks standardized down to the millimeter, trade weights calibrated so precisely that a merchant here could deal fairly with a stranger 1,000 kilometers away without either of them meeting face to face. You know, kneeling in that trench? That the DNA about to be pulled from this skeleton will travel to a lab, get compared against the bones of steppe pastoralists buried 3,000 kilometers northwest, in the Sintashta burial mounds of the Russian and Kazakh steppe, and come back with an answer that will unravel 150 years of settled history. She, of course, has no idea any of that is coming. She was just a woman, buried by people who loved her, in a city that was already, slowly, running out of water. The answer that came back from that lab didn't just identify one skeleton. It forced a rewrite of where every single group living in India today actually comes from. Here is the reframe that undoes almost everything the original story assumed. The Aryan invasion was never really one event where steppe migrants arrived and destroyed, then replaced, an indigenous population. The destruction, a slow climate-driven failure of monsoon rainfall and shifting rivers, and the migration that followed it were two separate events, centuries apart, later compressed into a single myth for reasons that had more to do with 19th century colonial politics and 20th century nationalist politics than with anything the DNA actually shows. The deeper twist sits underneath that correction. Nearly every group in India today, north or south, historically high-ranked or historically marginalized, urban or tribal, is a mixture of the exact same three ancestral populations: AASI, Iranian farmer-related, and steppe pastoralist-related, just in wildly different proportions. There is no genetically pure indigenous group waiting somewhere at the bottom of the mixture, and there is no genetically pure invading group sitting untouched at the top of it. There is one shared ancestral pool, sorted by history into locked compartments roughly 1,900 years ago. That single fact quietly undercuts two opposing stories at once. Both the old colonial claim that outsiders arrived to civilize a passive population and its mirror image nationalist rebuttal that no meaningful steppe migration happened at all. The 2019 dataset detected steppe ancestry in effectively every one of the roughly 140 sampled groups, from under 5% in some to well over 30% in others. Nobody comes back with zero. Clean story, gone. Even the language question, the one Max Muller started the whole theory with, refuses to fully resolve. The Indus Valley script has never been deciphered, which means nobody can say with certainty whether its builders spoke an early form of Dravidian, some now vanished, unrelated language family, or something else entirely. The who spoke what first half of this debate remains, genuinely, open. What has come into focus instead is the caste system itself, not as the direct creation of a single ancient invasion, the way generations were taught, but as a much later social innovation, one that took an already blended population and froze specific slices of that blend into place for 2,000 years. Which is why, when geneticists map identity in India today, it lines up far more precisely with the history of who was allowed to marry whom than with any single migration event 1,900 years distant. What that leaves behind is a picture stranger and more human than invaders versus natives ever was. And researchers studying it will tell you plainly that it's still being written. One geneticist working on South Asian ancient DNA has described opening a new sample less like solving a case and more like finding one more page of a book with most of its pages still missing. Step back far enough, and India stops looking like an exception. It starts looking like a magnified version of something true almost everywhere. Every population on Earth examined with ancient DNA turns out to be the same kind of layered wreckage. Europeans are a blend of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, early Anatolian farmers, and the same steppe pastoralists showing up in this story, folded together in their own forgotten collision. East Asian populations carry their own deep, largely unknown lineages. Most people alive today have never been taught existed. What makes South Asia unusual isn't that mixture happened. Mixture happens everywhere. It's the default condition of every human population that has ever existed. What's unusual is that, roughly 1,900 years ago, a social system arose sophisticated enough to freeze that mixture in place with a precision fine enough that geneticists can still read it, group by group, 2,000 years later, like a photograph developed so slowly it's still coming into focus under the light. That means well over 1 billion people alive right now are living inside boundaries drawn by decisions made by people who could not have imagined that one day a machine would sequence a molecule inside their descendants' cells and read the decision straight back out of it. The question was never really who invaded whom. It was always who decided the mixing had to stop. And why that decision, made in the shadow of cities already crumbling from drought, still quietly shapes a subcontinent of more than 1 billion people today. The Indians were never who we thought they were, and the DNA making that clear isn't closing the book on where they came from. It's only just now prying it back open